Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Alex Lamb. Good to see you, see the people who are here, and as I said, we'll have a few people coming in and out of the discussion. We're here today to discuss hybrid teams. It's a topic that as Sarah and I have been researching into it, that we've rekindled our interest and our depth of knowledge in, because it's definitely, I think, entered the lexicon as just casual terminology that we use all the time, that we've kind of habituated to, and maybe don't come back and really think often enough as to what does this really mean? What are we accustomizing ourselves to now? So we wanted to bring awareness back to this new working model, and particularly from the perspective of how we as HR practitioners enable businesses through leaders, managers, teams, and through the whole system to make sure that we're bringing the best out of this model and doing it consciously. So today we're going to go through what it means to be hybrid, implications of this model, signs that the teams are suffering, which I think everybody's aware of, but just a little bit of diagnostic there, how we bring coaching in for performance in this context, and we're going to think about coaching from the lens of hybrid skills, performance skills, and then human-centered skills as well, and that'll go through leaders, managers, and teams, and then what the implications are for practitioners here. So please do jump in if you've got questions, comments, as I said, on the chat, or you can come off and definitely interrupt at any point or have questions, but we will of course save some Q&A for the end as well. So I'll introduce myself here. I'm Alex Lamb. I'll just go back one slide, Sarah, sorry. I am based in Dubai, but I'm Australian. I'm an organizational psychologist and coach. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of Boldly. So we're going to introduce the business in a moment, but this topic of hybrid is something that I felt very passionate about for some time. Obviously, we got nudged into this model a lot more, than what we were expecting to be during that period. But it's definitely been something that I've been looking at from a work systems perspective for quite some time. So yeah, let me pass to you, Sarah, for an intro.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I think I know some of you at least, but my name's Sarah King, and my background is in organisation development, leadership development, and coaching. And I am in the fortunate position to be the MD of Boldly in Australia and New Zealand. And I'm very passionate about this topic of hybrid because of my interest in creating teams that can thrive and succeed. So I've been sort of dipping in and out of it. So it's been great to refresh and update the latest thinking on this topic in preparation for this webinar.
Fantastic, thanks, Sarah. And so Sarah, of course, is a great local resource for anyone who's based in Australia. So let me just introduce Boldly really briefly, and then we'll jump into the content. So I think you know us, but Boldly does everything coaching end to end. So whether it's one-off individual coaching engagements, group and teams, we have learning programs that we work with clients on, a coach-led training program for some key talent, such as first-time managers, hypo females, leaders, etc. And we also have some great coaching skills for supervisors programs. And then at the top of this image here, we have our coaching culture advisory. So for larger organizations looking at their systems, their operations of coaching, and how they embed that for transformation and change, we collaborate with clients globally across all of these areas. Okay, so let's jump ahead into the next slide. This is really just to set the scene for what we're here to discuss today. So if I'll summarize this for you. This was a survey that was run and that the research was published in Forbes just earlier this year. Nearly 75% of respondents to this survey said that they had not trained their managers to lead a distributed team. They hadn't established team meetings or norms or adopted best practices to support working across distances. So this is just to really bring into focus that we're often in this hybrid model now, but we've fallen into it unintentionally. We haven't put systems or training or programs around how to do this. We've just expected that our managers, our leaders would adapt and use their previous skill set to make this work. But considering that nearly 60% of employees now have the option to work remotely, and this is, of course, higher in Australia considering the labour laws, it's really concerning that we haven't made this investment in training for the skills, the knowledge, the attributes that it actually takes to be effective in hybrid. So this is really essential. We can't go walking into this blindly. And we do see that coaching, as well as these skill development, has a really key role before we have organizations polarize and say we're only working from the office or we're only working from home, which of course, we hear about those, really high profile companies that have camped out in either end. The reality is, based on the labour law, as I said, in Australia, that all organisations will be hybrid of some sort. And so this is actually a space that we need to be spending more attention on and more discussion. So with that in mind, let me hand over to you, Sarah, and we're going to walk through what it means to actually be hybrid.
Thanks, Alex. And I guess one of the points that I wanted to make is that we've invested a lot of time and money into developing hybrid tools for the workplace. So, rapid uptake of tools like Microsoft Teams and Zoom and Slack and all of the other things and all of the other stuff. But less investment has been made into coaching and developing leaders and teams to actually operate effectively in this environment. So when we're talking about hybrid, we're not just talking about flexible work arrangements. We may be talking about the mix of office and remote work. We might be talking about human interactions alternating between the sort of face-to-face and online environments. And the final point that I probably want to make here is that when we're talking about hybrid, we're talking about complex environments that are interconnected, non-linear, and often emergent, dynamic, and unpredictable. So we need a whole new set of skills as leaders to be operating in this environment. So when we start to talk about what does it mean, we've got some examples on the screen of what we're talking about in terms of the possible configurations. But it could be, in some organisations, it could be working literally from anywhere in the world. It could be working from home. It could be working remotely in a different state. And in Australia, that's been around for quite a long time. Or it might actually mean working in small hubs. So regardless of what our configuration is, how many days in the office we're working or not working, we need to be thinking about enhancing a leader's effectiveness of operating in this sort of environment. So I like this quote because we kind of have this view that hybrid makes everything simpler, easier for people, but in actual fact, it makes it more complex, not less complex. So as we're starting to look at the latest data, we've got some interesting juxtaposition between the data that PwC has shared in their Future of Work Outlook paper last year, which shows us that only 4% of employees in Australia want to work 5 days a week in the office. 27% of people want to work full-time remote. 65% of people want a mix of home and office. Employers are twice as likely to prefer full-time in the office. And 40% of Australian employees would prefer more people to be operating, to be having a greater number of days at home. So perhaps 2 days in the office, 3 days working from home. In contrast to that, we've actually got to look at KPMG's 2023 CEO Outlook study, which suggested that up to 64% of CEOs actually want us to be full-time back in the office by 2026. So that's an interesting challenge for our HR and people and culture people to balance those two sets of competing requirements. Another challenge that we want to think about, and this is where this idea of intentionality starts to come in, is that some recent data suggests that up to 30% of Australian businesses are actively monitoring or using monitoring technology in response to not having, line of sight of what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. But as with many of these things, there's a sense that we have stumbled into this approach, or that we're looking at the upside of monitoring in terms of control and productivity, but not necessarily considering the cultural implications of that. So just starting to think about some implications of the hybrid model, and again, just trying to get you up to date. I've done a bit of a scan of what all the most recent information is. Microsoft actually did a really huge study of their employees in 2022. So 68,000 of their employees were studied, and the data reveals that more dense connections existed within teams. So teams are more socially connected. There's more collaboration within teams. But that as soon as you start to step outside the boundaries of those teams, the collaboration networks become far more heavily siloed. So our tendency towards silos actually gets accentuated in this hybrid environment. And there's actually less connectivity and connection and collaboration between teams. So networks more static, less dynamic, so less changes in who's in the network, who's out of the network. Communication tools more varied, but less rich. And I think that's an interesting finding. So lots of people grappling with the volume of different tools through which to collaborate with people, etc. And then interestingly, also a decrease in the transfer of knowledge between people and the quality of outputs. So what's the implications of all of this? Does it mean we should just shut up shop and go back to work full time in the office? Or does it mean that actually instead of doing that, we need to start considering how we transition people to operate more effectively in this environment and how we support leaders to operate more effectively? And this is early days, obviously, but we're starting to get some good study from a neuroscience perspective. If we take Boyatsa-Smith et al.'s contention that within the brain we have two different networks operating, the data reasoning and empathy network, they act as a binary. So it's like a toggle switch. So you're either in one or the other. So as leaders are operating in this mode, if you're in front of a screen, Jack et al. Suggested that actually we're creating an empathy gap because online communication channels automatically prime us to be operating in the data reasoning mode, which means that the empathy mode is switched off. So how do we actually start to equip teams and leaders to recognise this and put in place intentional practices that support them to move out of that mode? So Alex, maybe if I hand back to you for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. So we thought it would be helpful to go through some signs that hybrid teams are suffering, although we know, our clients are experienced in this space. So it's, all of these things you probably know and have seen before. We just come on to the next slide, Sarah. So a lot of these areas, it's emerging research. So we can't have clear attribution. And of course, they're pretty broad statements, but declining productivity and engagement, you might see some indications that you can attribute to the hybrid environment there. Communication breakdowns, absolutely. And there's a lot of blaming of the model for this, as opposed to, as we said, like intentionally coming into the model with new communication skills. Feelings of isolation and disconnection, that can be purely from work from home, but also in that hybrid sense of, we're going to talk following about the importance of nurturing relationships in offices. We all know that, but really intentionally doing that within this hybrid scenario. Blurred work-life boundaries, and then lack of career development opportunities. There is a strong sense from the candidate base and the employee base that unless I'm physically in front of people, unless I'm being seen, unless my work is really obvious, that the system won't acknowledge and recognize me, and therefore that will limit my opportunities. So if you're hearing some of these, of course, you'll be doing your own internal diagnostics to work out, is it about hybrid? Is it about other elements of our culture and our leadership framework? But we would encourage you to bring this to your, awareness. So we've written a really thorough blog. You can capture it there, or we can share it afterwards as well, which goes more into some of these areas of the diagnostic, but then specifically, strategies about how you can coach those hybrid teams, which we'll be discussing some in the following slides as well. So if we just move on to that, the coaching, how we see coaching as having a very unique differentiator as an intervention for the hybrid context. We see coaching as being unique because it can be personalized, it can be so malleable and adaptable, it doesn't have a one size fits all, and therefore it's very uniquely positioned to infiltrate the system that you have for hybrid and make sure that you isolate pockets of effectiveness, learn from those, and disseminate them out to other teams. So what we're really looking at with coaching is moving from that surviving mode, which we've come out of from 2020, back into a thriving mode. How do we make sure that we take hybrid, we bring the intentionality to it, which means bringing skill sets, bringing awareness, bringing an internal dialogue around what it means to be hybrid, so that we can take coaching and really disseminate the effectiveness. So just on to the next slide. What we're seeing is we need to be able to take coaching at all the different levels of your system, where we often see coaching and skill development at the intervention of the manager and the leader. Of course, as investment points within your business, they make sense because they have such a ramification. They have a trickle down effect to the rest of the business. But thinking about the team and how you coach that team intact for their communication style, their relationship building, their network ability across that group, I say group there interchangeably, but across that team is so essential as well. But really zooming out and think how coaching the culture to how you're coaching the system. Do managers have the coaching skills? We're not just talking here about bringing in externally. Maybe there's an element of external coaches at each of these levels, but then it's also embedding these skills so that peer-to-peer coaching can work, manager to direct report can work, leader into the system of the frameworks and the policies and the working practices can work as well. So really making sure that we use coaching as a style, which by that we mean questioning, bringing awareness, opening up dialogue at all of those different levels so that we can create that intentionality. So we often focus on the leader. They're absolutely key to begin with, but we bring your awareness to the rest of this landscape as well. So I'll just pass back to Sarah now, and we'll start talking through how you can bring that coaching lens to the across those different areas. Just bear that in mind. We're talking teams, managers, leaders, and the whole system to bring in this skill set.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I think one of my observations is that I'm starting to observe the uptick in interest in team coaching, and I think that's exacerbated or amplified by the need to be able to operate effectively in a hybrid environment. So if we look at how do we intentionally focus on the skills that leaders require to operate in this environment, we can sort of categorize them in three different buckets, if you like. So the human-centered skills, so how do we build connection? How do we coach people? How do we use empathy to work with people in this environment? And we're particularly seeing with the increase in focus on well-being and particularly within the Australian context, the requirement to look after psychosocial safety and all that sits alongside that. So human-centered skills are critical for that. But then alongside that, we also need to be looking at skills specific to operating in the hybrid environment. So how do you lead? How do you have performance conversations? How do you amplify the level of transparency and trust in a hybrid environment? And then the performance focused skills, which of course have been a traditional focus anyway. So we know that operating in this hybrid environment requires us to develop the perspective taking capacity of leaders and their mental complexity. So that includes being able to acknowledge and see competing needs, to understand their own biases, and to acknowledge that some of our previous mental models no longer apply in this new context. So in the past, if we could see what people were doing, that was how we monitored performance and got results in the business. We need to actually start letting go of those models and think about how we do that in this new world. So some mindset shifts, and these won't be news, I suspect, to any of you, but it's always worth calling these things out. We need to shift from that command and control leadership, because leaders in a hybrid environment cannot and do not have all the answers. In the complexity, in the uncertainty of the modern world, information rich, we need to actually rely on shared, distributed, and compassionate styles of leadership. Again, we need to shift from micromanagement and control. I don't know that that ever really worked, but it certainly doesn't work in the hybrid environment. So how do we play out those skills or develop those skills to build trust and accountability? Shift from delegating tasks to responsibilities, which is a much broader thing. And of course, in the past, where managers might have decided when, where, and how the work is done, now, as leaders, we might be delegating those responsibilities, but there is an expectation increasingly in the hybrid environment that employees are the ones that are deciding when, where, and how. And then the final one, which is really, I think, one of the big call-outs from today's session, which is this need to shift from implicit cultural signals to explicit cultural signals. So how do we have the conversation around when we're in a meeting together, and this is not a hint for today, by the way, but just more broadly speaking, if we're in a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting, a camera's on or off, we expect participation, etc. So having those conversations, and in my coaching practice, one of the things that you come across is this thing of leaders struggling to have those conversations and set those clear expectations. Teams need to have those conversations. It can't be a binary thing where the leader's dictating and the team's complying or not complying. So having those conversations as a team is really crucial. So then when we step into enabling intentional leadership, so I love this idea of ending productivity paranoia. If we start from the premise that most people want to do meaningful and purposeful work, that we measure them on their outcomes and their delivery rather than on the number of keystrokes or the time spent in doing tasks. If we reset this idea around why would people come into the office, and embrace the fact that part of the reason that brings people into the office is actually the social connectivity and the opportunity to collaborate. And then this idea that we need to re-recruit our employees, that we can't afford to just coast on the models and the thinking of the past. So what would we add? Well, we would add that we need to create the capacity to have safe to fail experimentation, or as Amy Edmondson calls it, this idea of intelligent failures. So are we blithely doing test and learns and then just implementing them? So we do one test and learn, something works okay, and then we just implement that. My sense is that's a lot of how we're actually operating. How do we purposefully increase levels of interaction and communication? And how do we start to embrace the dissent and diversity in our workplaces? So, Alex, I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about this, but we did want to make sure we knew that we had a mix of people joining today, either coaches or HR practitioners. And so we wanted to make sure there was something in here for everyone. And really, when we start to think about how do we move from implicit to explicit, from unintentional to intentional ideas of leadership, one of the things we know we need to do is grow the complexity of leaders, their ability to step outside their own biases and default frames of thinking and actually start to recognise multiple perspectives and different ways of doing things. Anything you wanted to add here, Alex?
Yeah, I think we could probably go through a couple just to dissect them, because these are questions that HR could sit in front of a leader and ask, as you know, if you have a leader who's presenting to you with a challenge around managing or leading their hybrid workforce, or as you said, Sarah, coaches, you know, bringing that awareness. So if I just look at the first one, what might it look like if you relinquish some control in that situation, where again, bringing awareness, we are bringing, you know, putting light on this point that, is it control? This is about you, boss. This is about your sense of control. It's not about the hybrid system. It's not about the workplace. It's not about all your employees. How do you shift the locus of control onto the boss? And look, they don't own it all, but they do need to bring awareness to themselves. And the opposite to that is, what would it look like if you tighten control? So getting them to think in both directions, it just allows them to lens shift. Sometimes we find leaders are feeling themselves put upon, that they are the recipients or sometimes even the victims of the hybrid work model. Yeah, that things were simpler in the olden days when I could just see my whole team in one place, and that now this is a real challenge for them to adjust to. So creating that safe space where you acknowledge that this is hard for them, but getting them to bring awareness to the fact that they're having this you know, sense of loss of control, and that kind of questioning could help you open up some dialogue there. The next one there around, like, what strategy are you using to respond to the messiness you're perceiving? Just using that word strategy, it elevates the leader to think, this is strategic. It's not just this inconvenient thing that's happening in terms of where my staff are sitting. This is a real, you know, element of the makeup of my business now. And then by asking the question in this way, what strategies are you using? You're putting the leader in the frame of mind that they are actually in the driver's seat of this. Okay, I'm not the victim, I'm not the receiver of a hybrid model. You know, yes, I may have to receive it, but actually I can drive this to something that can be strategic for my business. What signals are you seeing? Again, it asks them to bring awareness to what they're observing from their staff, from the productivity output, and asking them to quantify that. When you ask what signals do you expect to see, what will they mean, what are you actually seeing, this is a way for us to dig under what is the emotional response of the leader versus that of what they're observing. Well, you know, the signals that I'm seeing is that everybody's productivity has dropped. Okay, that's really interesting. Can you show me where you see the drop in productivity? Well, what I'm seeing is that no one's engaged, no one's chatting. Okay, what have you done to create new communication lines? And it's not to create a combative discussion. Of course, you're there to business partner or to collaborate with them, but it's to scratch one point down from the emotional sense of what they're seeing to what is actually the evidence that you're experiencing this hybrid. That hopefully, with your trust and your collaboration, brings you into a conversation about, oh, actually, we're not seeing a dip in productivity if you're not, okay? Or, oh, actually, yeah, you're right, we have seen a dip in communication channels. What could we do about that? As opposed to blame and shame the staff for not communicating, how do we now create a strategy for communication? So this is what we mean about bringing the intentionality, bringing the awareness. Hopefully some of these questions just give you that chance to open that dialogue. The last one that I'll mention, which I really like, is for a lot, and again, we're talking about leaders, you might use this with some of your managers. How does your personal history impact your expectations of this workplace now? We're working with leaders who have come up through the ranks of, you had to be in the office. Like, I even think about myself. When I first started my first job, it was 8 to 6. If I wasn't there 8 to 6, someone thought something was wrong. If I wasn't wearing my suit and my pantyhose, right, and closed-toe shoes, I literally had a uniform. I think about that now because the workplace that we're now in is so much more fluid, dynamic, human, interesting in a lot of places. There's still a lot of you know, formality in other ways. But if we think about a lot of the leaders we're coaching, they came up in that series of, you have to wear a suit and tie, you have to wear pantyhose. We were born of that model of structure and discipline and boundaries, right? And now we have this sense of coming into a little bit less boundary management, a little bit more fluid. That personal history, bringing awareness to a leader for that, to say, well, actually things have shifted and I see where you're coming from. And that's probably why you want to retain what you knew of from your performance environment, what you knew of how to grow a career. Those things have shifted. So how do those models serve you now? And what new mental models might we need to bring in? So again, you can see the role of the coach, bringing awareness, shifting to new perspectives, and then hopefully being able to work together in strategizing for that way forward. Thanks, Sarah. Is there anything else you noticed there, just as you look at the questions? You can feel like I get razzed about coaching questions. So
yeah, me too. Look, I think that the other thing that resonates for me is this idea of helping leaders to let go of the notion of rightness and control. And that's often the hardest thing for leaders to actually start to create some distance from. And I think in a hybrid workplace, it's probably the number one challenge for leaders that I've worked with over the last few years is how do I empower my teams to act, but create this sense of connectivity. So there's all these kind of polarities that they're grappling with in a hybrid environment. And I think there's a really crucial role that HR or people and culture teams can play in addition to internal and external coaches with that. So
hey, Sarah,
the next
Joe.
Hey, Joe.
Hi. Sorry, I just wanted to add, maybe this is the wrong time, but I think I put my camera back on. I don't know how that's working. I'm on my phone. It might be. So my background is working globally, working in hybrid teams for the past 20 years. So it's really interesting watching and starting to talk to people in the Australian market about how they're dealing with these teams. And what you said at the start, like the whole mindset shift and the level of complexity is so true, because it's not just call a meeting, write an agenda. You have to think about how to engage people. Some people might be on the phone. Some people might be at home. Some people might be on the other side of the world and it's 10 o'clock for them and it's 6 a.m. for someone else. So do you have a 5-hour-long meeting for the person where it ends up being 3 a.m. or do you cut and paste? And do you have meetings over 2 weeks rather than, 5 hours in one session? So that complexity, just listening to what you're saying, I think you're right. If you're not used to dealing with that, it's really, really challenging. And I think I would say all need to give themselves time to dedicate to what do I need to do? Because if they're really busy and they continue to do fly by the seat of their pants stuff we always did, then you miss all of those little nuances which really impact people joining and becoming part of that team. So I've really experienced some of that, and I think lots of these things you're talking about are really spot on.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I absolutely can resonate with what you're saying. A couple of my coachees are local, as in Australian-based members of global organisations. And, constantly comes up this idea of, I'm required to be in meetings at 2 a.m. in the and for myself, I had a job interview at 12:30 on a Friday night. So not 12:30 at lunchtime, but at Friday night. So we do need to start being more intentional and thoughtful about how we're doing this. So as we start to kind of move
if I just comment too, I think it brings it back really nicely to your previous point about empathy is that, have I actually thought about the receivers? And I think that's a great point, Joe, is that no one can bend time zones, right? Like that is fixed and it's not hard to work out where they are. And sometimes there just is no solution to making a good time for a call, particularly when you've got so many people. Like our team Boldly are based in every corner of the globe and we always have this challenge. And so that's where it comes back to, first of all, empathy, the leader being cognizant of it. And then second of all, this intentionality about ways of working. Do you split and have two, like we, for example, have 2 separate town hall calls so that people can come into each one, share the same information across both, but then people can, choose a time zone that works for them. So I often found when I was working in Sydney, people weren't even thinking, oh, what time is it in Auckland and what time is it in Perth? Can I get that? But they were always receiving, like that call with London. Now I'm on the receiving end of it, I get it. So it has to be able to go in both directions. And I think until someone's received a bum call time, right, then you actually don't open up that awareness and that empathy for others either. So, yeah, good point.
And can I just add, I think the level of seniority of the person also is impacted by what I've found is more junior people are less likely to push back and they will turn up to a 3 a.m. call. versus someone more senior or been around for a long time is a little bit more gutsy, and they'll go, there's no way I'm joining that call at 3 a.m. And managers miss that point. The reason that person is on at 3 a.m. is because they don't want to miss out and they want to make sure they're engaged, and they're too junior to say no. So managers really have to be conscious of all of that.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Jo. So when we start to kind of make that connection then with that idea of empathy, increasing our capacity to communicate in this environment, we know that the most successful managers in this sort of hybrid environment, and Jo, you've probably worked in an environment that's had the time to build this over a number of years, but a lot of organisations almost fell into it during COVID. They might have been starting to work towards flexible work practices. Certainly the organisation that I used to work in back then already had a bunch of flexible work practices in place, but I don't think we'd really given a huge amount of thought to the practical day-to-day implications on ways of working of hybrid working. And I think that's where we need to really start thinking about it. So we know that the people who are really successful in this space create space for people, they create space for social connection. It's not all 100% about performance. If I think back to my own experience during the first couple of lockdowns, I knew more about my team's pets, parents with illnesses, pregnancies, every other aspect of things. And there was this real sense of social cohesion and connection in that team, but that was deliberately and intentionally built. We were lucky enough to work in the space of teaming, so we kind of put a lot of effort into having these intentional conversations. But my experience over the last couple of years has shown that not all managers have actively had those conversations with people or even given it a lot of thought. They've kind of just fallen into hybrid ways of working. So the other thing, if we come back to the Microsoft study, is just around the need to really engage in dynamic network mapping. So if we're really starting to try to move from, this sort of assumption that working in the office 5 days a week is always best, and that's how we build culture, then we actually need to equip leaders with how do we actually start to map a new network and think differently about that. So I'm going to skip over that a little bit, but it's this idea that when we're looking at motivation, we need to be thinking about competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And a lot of these big strategic decisions aren't necessarily playing the ball effectively when it comes to those three things. So I did want to share one practical tip for leaders and coaches and HR practitioners as well, and that is around, so if we have this binary toggle switch between data reasoning, which is activated in an online environment such as we're in today, how do we intentionally switch from that mode into empathy so that we can focus on those human-centered skills, so that as a coach, we can really connect with our coachee, or as a leader, we can build connection with our people. So a couple of handy questions, just taking the time to drop into how we're feeling right now. So what's the emotion that I'm experiencing? What's going on in my body? Getting out of our heads and into our feelings. How might this other person be feeling? And what might be most important to this person right now. So a couple of other strategies in here. One is that if you're moving from, as I was doing this morning, working on spreadsheets to connecting with people, you can change rooms, you can, stand up and spin around, you can shift chairs, you can go from a sitting meeting to a standing meeting, etc. But it's about being intentional about switching from data reasoning into empathic networks. When I'm in coaching sessions, I often pay attention to the energy that people bring into the coaching session. And if they've got that sort of frantic energy that we all get when we're going from one online meeting to another, or when we're racing from one face-to-face meeting up the stairs or down the stairs to another meeting room, is actually taking a pause and just going, okay, let's just arrive in our meeting together, and actually doing 3 slow breaths or box breathing or whatever your preferred breathing strategy is. But what that allows your brain to do is just slow down, let go of everything that happened in the last meeting, and just be present in this meeting. And then in a group meeting, this idea of let's take a minute to arrive. So we don't expect that we're going to start on task-related activities until we've all arrived together in the meeting. So then as we start to move into the kind of the performance-focused skills, we need to recognise that our managers need to be managing people's experiences and the delivery of work. And so they actually need to be able to toggle between those different aspects. And I think what leaders that I've been working with really struggle with is, and particularly as I've worked with some of the professional services leaders, how am I balancing the need to deliver performance, deliver outcomes, build the business, deliver those high demand projects at the same time as balancing the well-being of my team in this new environment. And I think that's something that leaders really grapple with. So then they also need the skills to manage their people in that hybrid context. So thinking about across time and place, how do we actually work in that environment? So a couple of quick questions. Alex, maybe you wanted to jump in here?
Yeah, happy to. So questions from HR practitioner might be, posing it back to the business. Are our leaders engaging in spontaneous skip level communications? That would be an indication of dynamic communications that are happening, not just in confined pre-organized meetings, but that is there a fluidity of discussion that's happening akin to what we used to see in offices. Again, that takes intentionality from the leader. Our leaders calling awareness to interdependence of the colleagues. So this is about the explicit piece that Sarah was mentioning before. Of course, it's implicit that we're interdependent. We need finance to work with HR, to work with, tech, to et cetera, et cetera. But is the leader calling that to people's consciousness so that they're aware of having to reach across the aisle, so to speak, to make those communication boundaries stronger? And then is our goal setting ongoing and continuously recalibrated? So the companies that I see do hybrid well aren't stuck in the days of set and forget performance and never give feedback and etc. So all of the best performance related performance management cutting edge science that we know about continuous feedback and the skills that are required to underpin that are so much more pertinent now in the hybrid model. So this is really about our system and about that individual leader being enabled, whether you're in an OKRs model or a KPIs model, are they enabled to make sure that that's a continuous goal setting and that it's continuously under discussion, it's in front of people's eyes, it's being, on a rolling basis being discussed, just so that it, otherwise it is, we definitely fall back into that problem that we had before, even in the office, of the set and forget. Yeah,
thanks,
leave
Alex.
you there. Yeah.
And then if we start to think explicitly, obviously there's many hybrid skills to think about, but 2 that I wanted to call out in particular are this idea about being intentional. So making team agreements. We used to, many years ago, do lots of team charters and so on. But in a hybrid world, we really need to be very explicit around our expectations of when people are working, how they're going to communicate, how you're going to keep people in the loop, etc. So really starting to think about that. And then additionally, this idea of establishing your workflows, your ways of working, and having those explicit conversations. Have we built capacity and capability in our teams to actually have those conversations and work in that collaborative style. So some implications for HR practitioners, and we've got a few of those on the call. So have we really thought about the psychosocial risks and obligations? So we know that there's increased complexity in this environment. There's increased need to balance wellbeing and performance, and how do we ensure that work is happening, etc. And how do we ensure that we've skilled our leaders in collaborative strategies and critical thinking? How are we encouraging cross-functional networking across the business? And how are we building in networking as a feature of onboarding? And when we start to think about this, this is particularly pertinent for new arrivals into the workplace. So, you know, thinking about grads who are entering the workplace for the first time, what are the implicit cultural signals that they might be potentially missing out on? And how do we address that? So some macro strategies to think about. And Alex, I don't know whether this one was a one for you to talk about or a me to talk about. Did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, happy to. These are a few things that we're suggesting is really that we all as practitioners and custodians of workplace culture bring the hybrid message much more deeply into our value proposition, whether that's our employment value proposition as we're messaging it out to candidates, or the internal messaging, but not making hybrid this kind of inconvenient truth, but how do we reframe that lens and really show it as, here's a positive because we have created ways of working that have optimized this model. So it can very much become a part of your brand. Similar to what we've seen Atlassian do with their 100% remote, they are known for that, okay, for making it work and really driving it as part of their culture. Hybrid could be embedded and shown as a positive for you as well. Shift the thinking from the where to the how. This is the piece around focusing on objectives and outcomes. We do find a lot of leaders are very, very fixed on where the work is happening rather than is the work being effective. Some of this might be motivated by, real estate, old ways of thinking about what work happens. And again, some of those coaching questions that we shared earlier should help you at that, interface with a leader or a manager to shift to how is the work actually happening. Being intentional, I think we've used that word throughout, and hopefully that becomes part of your lexicon here as well. Boost productivity and well-being by giving you control. So this speaks back to Sarah's point around competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Okay, if we see adults and leaders who have grown and flourished and really gone from surviving through COVID to thriving in hybrid, this is about, are they competent? Do they have the skills to be effective in hybrid? Do they have a sense of autonomy? Like, okay, I've got the ability to get my work done so long as I produce the results in the best way that I can. And then this relatedness, just being so connected to the relationship piece. My strong instinct, and I believe there's research around this, is that if employees feel like they have one strong friend at work, then they feel that relatedness, they feel the connectedness. And of course, hopefully they have more than that of one strong friendship. But so long as you can boost that relatedness sense, you're hitting into the productivity and the well-being as a byproduct of hitting these other important fundamentals. So identifying the technologies and the practices. So we've got a great podcast. Sarah and I will share out a pack following this. It's a HBR IdeaCast podcast that just came out last week around the technologies. And actually a lot of us, when it comes to hybrid, we think, we just need the right Slack channel, or we just need the right MS Teams environment, or we need the right, way our Jira is set up, or our Confluence. And we can project the problems of hybrid onto our technologies. It's very common. But actually thinking, if we're going to use these technologies, do people have the skills, the ability, the way of communicating? One company that I've worked with very closely globally is Uber, who do a fantastic job of hybrid. And that is because they've got technologies that are at their simplest form, but the human skill is able to animate those technologies with ways of reaching across silos, collaborating, They have coffee catch-ups. They have roulette of people, you know, spending time with others from, you know, thought leadership. They have mentorship programs that happen across their technology. And so not just the tech, not to project onto the tech, but really think about, have we trained for the practices that are going to animate and engage that technology effectively? Leadership and teaming skills that we've mentioned, some of those, particularly around the communication and the breaking down of the silos, and then the intentionally, you know, embedding rituals. So, you know, our company, of course, it's only once a year, but because we have 100%, you know, remote actually, so we're not even hybrid. And I think there's a lot of skills and knowledge, a lot of strategies from 100% remote that can be applied to hybrid, not perfectly, but in some cases can. We have a lot of rituals around our team catch-ups, around, as Sarah said, like the check-ins. How are we all before, you know, before jumping into task work? Have we actually checked in with each other and know each other as people? So being able to think about how those come through and how you're incentivizing, rewarding, quote unquote, not in the traditional financial sense, but acknowledging and encouraging those behaviors when you see them through the system. So with that in mind, I know we're coming up to time and we would like to offer out some Q&A. So please, anyone, feel free to come off mute and ask questions. But Sarah, just I have got one question here that's just been DM'd to me. Which companies have you seen doing hybrid well? Anything that we can follow and learn from? So I'll answer briefly. You've seen some case study material here from Microsoft. I've just mentioned Uber, two companies that are in the tech space. So of course they have a vested interest in making sure that, you know, their products and their industry are, you know, synonymous with effective working styles. But having said that, they do have people who are willing to take that personal responsibility for connectivity and building relationships. You might be thinking, well, these are both massive companies. They're not in my industry. It just happens to be that we can take, because of the size of the data set, particularly with Microsoft and the way they've been tracking it, we're able to take real insights and real world implications from the data. But I do see there's a lot of that can extrapolate down. Again, we'll share a pack after this. The research that Sarah shared is really, really interesting to go deeper into. So we'll share those links for you to see from those companies. But I don't know any other companies, Sarah, that you've come across. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Seen lots of organisations that are doing it. It's kind of hard to know at this point who's doing it particularly well. I think there are a lot of organisations that are doing it by default at the moment, is my sense. But I'm certainly aware of some organisations that are putting deliberate sort of change and leadership strategies in place to support their leaders and coach their leaders to actually make a thoughtful and intentional transition rather than just we're doing it because we have to. So yeah, no names that come to mind, but I'd love to know if either Marianne or Amanda or Joe or Maggie have any questions as well.
Yeah, Joe's got a question here in the chat. Just wondering how much of that push to be in the office is driven by existing lease. So in Australia, my personal opinion was a lot of it.
A lot.
That there, yeah, but I don't have research or insight on that. It was my sense. There was a lot of product sitting on the shelf for a long time, a lot of expensive product. So I have a sense that there's political, you know, lobbying, so to speak. Yeah, I don't know. Is it a loaded question? Do you have an opinion on that, Joe?
No, I was just curious because I know how much it costs. So I was wondering, because costs are tight. So, you know, it's wasted if no one's there. But yeah. The only other thing I'd say about the whole, you know, is an organisation doing it better? I would say there's, regardless of the organisation level, if you dig in, there's probably teams who do it really well and teams who don't do it really well. So I think you'd find, you know, even at where I was, which, yes, did it, like you said, was able to work it over a long period of time, there was still teams who did it really well and teams who had a lot of work to do.
And the differentiator, Joe, I think I would agree, because my previous large organisation was similar and had been doing it for a long time as well. And I would say the difference often comes down not to the technology, but to the leadership and the psych safety in the team and how explicit they are in the conversations around ways of working. And I think that's, you know, that would be my finishing point in terms of what I think differentiates organisations that do it well and do it badly.
Yeah.
No problem. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, I was saying no problem out loud because Marianne has just had to drop off. Any other questions that we have? Oh, okay. Well, we are coming to time. So what I would say is just a huge thank you to Sarah for presenting. There's a lot of thought leadership and a lot of expertise embedded here. So thank you so much. It's been great to collaborate with you on this. If I was to summarize my takeaways, I would say, you know, intentionality has been the name of the day. The coaching elements at the team, the manager, the leader, and of the whole system. We have some really practical ways of coaching at each of those levels for communication, connectivity, you know, autonomy, and making sure that that relatedness and the intentionality of, you know, being explicit about ways of working is there. So as everyone goes forth, we just encourage you to, you know, think and really bring consciousness, bring awareness to how this is working and operating in your business. Get it on the agenda as a discussion point, and we're always happy to discuss more, in terms of either coaching or just general thought partnership on this topic. So thank you everyone for joining, much appreciated.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.